Good morning and welcome. My name's Richard Holton. For those of you who don't know me, I'm President of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the Academy's 2023 Symposium, Digital Society Annual Social Science Perspectives for a Better Future. And before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to introduce traditional owner Auntie Violet Sheridan, who will welcome us to her country.
Thank you, but before I go in my welcome, I'd like to acknowledge your CEO, Dr. Chris Hatherley. Did I get that right, Chris? Woo. Well, welcome to the land of the Ngunnawal people. This is my mother's country. My mother is a Ngunnawal woman. My father is a Wiradjuri man, but I follow my mother's bloodline. My people have lived here for many, many years before they forcefully moved us out of here, and a lot of my family ended up around Yass. In between Yass and Burrawa, there's a little place called Ride Park. A lot of my family ended up out there. My great-grannies built a mud hut out there, and it still stands today. And also those older generations, there's pit toilet out there as well. So when I was a little girl, I used to be so scared of falling down there. So it is my pleasure, not feeling really sad at the moment since the 14th of October. The outcome we didn't get, but I feel drained because the amount of work alongside most of my family members and other community members, and I take my heart is broken for particularly Thomas Mayo. He put so much passion into the yes vote, and I feel sorry that we couldn't get it up. But we extended our hands to First Nations people, to the wider Australian community, and they've turned their back. So I will take that to my grave, knowing that our Australian people didn't support us with this. It was a voice, it included us in the Constitution as First Nations people, and the voice really was all about us solving our problems. It wasn't about what I tried to explain to people, coming to take your backyard. I don't want your backyard. I said to them, because I'm too lazy to mow my own. So, you know, it is so sad, and people would, you just get people and say to us, you need to get over it. I can't get over it because it was so, would have solved our problems, because I got 28 grandchildren. I just had another 2 great grannies, and my biggest concern is when I'm no longer here, will they have a voice? And my sister lived down at Wagga, and she's heartbroken too because they put a lot of energy into that. They were in the top 10% of communities that voted no. And one of her friends told her that a friend of hers, you know why she didn't vote yes? You would not believe this, because she didn't like Qantas. So some of the answers that come out was really, it's heartbroken, but you know, we've been here for 65,000 years. We'll probably be here for more than 65,000 years. I won't be here because I'll be 69 soon. So, welcome to the land of the Ngunnawal people. I believe a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners of the land welcoming you, but it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you are meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit about not going into someone else's house or home unless you're welcome or invited. I believe this is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, and protect your spirit while you are here. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit, walking into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders, past, present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today as well. But I'd also like to acknowledge all the non-Indigenous people here as well, and listen up, I only say this in Canberra. In keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure once again to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. And on behalf of my family and the other Ngunnawal families, I say welcome, welcome. And you know, when I went to school, I didn't like science. But you know what? I've been rubbing shoulders with a lot of scientists lately, and I love it now. So the Shy Dome, when I was a little girl, I thought it was a spaceship. I used to die to get in there, and I've been going in there now for the last couple of years. I get excited because when we had that big hailstorm and everything was damaged there, and everything's done up, and it's such a lovely old building, and it's precious that we've still got that. So have a great conference, and you're in the best city in Australia, you know, Canberra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auntie Violet, for that wonderful welcome to your country. And let me pay my own respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and to any other First Nations people with us here today. I've got a few acknowledgements to make. I'd like to acknowledge our fantastic symposium organising committee who've put together the great program that we have before us today. So thanks to Sharon Parker, Sarah Pink, Andrew Burton-Jones, Anthony Elliott and Alan Peterson. Unfortunately, Anthony and Alan and I think Sarah are unable to join us today, but we'll hear from Sharon, Andrew and others throughout the day. I'd also like to thank the Academy staff and in particular Anna Dennis for putting so much work into making today a success, and also to the staff at the National Library of Australia for their support and generosity. So there's, as usual, a few extremely boring housekeeping notes. First, but rather important depending on what happens, bathrooms are located just outside the theatres. The catering breaks will take place upstairs in the foyer where you came in, got your name badges and so on. For those on social media, please tag us using our Twitter or X handle at ACADSocSci and the hashtag #DigitalSociety23 for today's event. And finally, in the event of an alarm or an evacuation order, please make your way to the exits in an orderly manner. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sharon Parker and to give some opening remarks. Sharon's list of accomplishments is far too long for me to list here, but I can briefly summarise that Sharon's the John Curtin Distinguished Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Curtin University, an ARC Laureate Fellow, and as I mentioned, a key member of the organising committee for today. So with that, over to you, Sharon.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Auntie Violet, for your welcome and blessing. And I too pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal, did I get that right? People. I come from the land of the Whadjuk people in Western Australia. I pay my respects to them also. So welcome to the Digital Society Conference, where we are tackling this question of social sciences perspective for a better future. So I want to ask the question, what will our future be? And we see in the media sometimes these two contrasting perspectives. The utopian perspective, where we all are meandering around having a lot of leisure time while the robots and the machines do all the work. And I think there was a very famous economist who predicted this future. I think it was John Maynard Keynes. Is there thank you. Yes. Is that the world we're going to live in? Or is our future actually going to be that dystopian perspective that we also see portrayed in the media, where we have massive unemployment, where we have huge disparity in society between the privileged and the non-privileged? Which of these futures might we have? And is this even the right question to be asking? Of course, if we want to understand the future, we need to look back to the past. And the first session this morning is all about understanding the past. And in the organising committee, we talked about, this question of, is it different this time? because we know from history that everybody's always expecting that these major technological revolutions will create mass unemployment and some of that dystopia, and it hasn't necessarily. But is this time different? Actually, we are now automating cognitive work, professional work, creativity, empathy, even machines. Well, it's not quite the right way of saying it, but they can at least detect emotions and so on. We're seeing self-learning machines who can actually autonomously act in our world. And for these reasons, maybe this time is different. So I'm really looking forward to our first session, which will be tackling this question of, is this time any different? The second series will be about bridging the digital divide, inclusion and equity. And all of us will be familiar with the shocking examples of bias that we're already seeing occurring as a result of AI in society. So, you know, the classic story of Google sending its high-paying advertisements to men because traditionally men have had the high-paying jobs. So we have this idea that AI will be less biased because it's objective, but in fact, it can actually really accelerate and ramp up bias. And I was thinking about this question actually in the context of ageing, because I had to do a little talk on this for the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing that I'm part of. And I investigated this a little bit. If you look at the major developers of technology, they are young and male. Look at Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, people believe their careers are over when they're 30. That is the age bias that happens in that world. We have Mark Zuckerberg, famous for saying younger people are just smarter. You wouldn't want to be saying that in front of this audience, would he? We have facial recognition programs which very rarely include faces over the age of 70. So we have already a lot of bias creeping into our algorithms and our AI. We have older people in society who are less aware of AI and algorithms and what it all means. There was a Norwegian study that showed that on average 41% of people do not know that algorithms are underpinning certain actions. But if you look at people over 60, that figure was 71%. So 71% did not even realise that algorithms were underpinning the decision-making in some cases. There's a beautiful example also of a septuagenarian in Spain who was rebelling against the closure of banks and the replacing of real banks, where you can talk to humans, with digital banks. And he actually mounted a campaign to stop bank closure, and he had a saying, "Soy mayor no idiota." I don't speak Spanish and probably did a really bad job of that, but it basically means I'm old, not an idiot, and really was campaigning for services that don't require so much knowledge about digitalisation to navigate the system, because on average older people struggle more with that. So that's the second session. The third session, we're going to go a little bit deeper into human technology interactions. So we're going to have a look at how do humans and technology work together. And one question I would pose here is, if we take the Boeing 737 tragic crashes where more than 394 people were killed a few years back, and we take Robodebt, where more than 400,000 Australian people took a class action against that. What do those two radically different scenarios have in common? What they have in common is that humans were left out of the loop in the decision-making. Pilots were left out of the loop in the case of particular technology that was installed in Boeing 737, and human decision-makers were left out of judgments in the Robodebt case, which caused all the fiasco that you're all very familiar with. So that's what we'll delve into in the third session. And the fourth session is, I think, a really exciting one, and why we're all here, which is, what is the role of social science in shaping this digital society. So we know that technocentrism dominates this world. We know that most of the, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in another presentation, most of the money is going to the technical development in AI. If there's any money going to human things, it's going to teaching people about human skills, about digital skills, which is still sort of technical, actually. So what can we be doing in the social sciences to change this situation? I think that social science has a huge role to play. We have historians who can tell us about the past. We've got lawyers who can tell us about regulation, economists who can model the impact of bad decisions in this space or good decisions in this space, who can look at tax systems and how they incentivise the use of machines versus people. We've got psychologists who can look at the human impact on our lives and meaning and cognition and so on. Sociologists who can look at power, and isn't there there's no more important topic, I think, to look at than power in this space. Anthropologists and many more. I'm not going to go through all the social science disciplines. But if I return to that question at the beginning, what sort of future might we have, the utopian or the dystopian? I think that social science have got a critical role to play in shaping us towards at least a better, fairer society and not that dystopian society. So I hope that you will have a fantastic day. We have got a great program lined up, and I really look forward to the discussion that we will have amongst ourselves to shape a better future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I think that was perhaps the best advertisement for staying around for the rest of the day for a symposium that I've ever heard. It sounds very exciting. So I'm now going to have the pleasure of introducing the chair of our first panel, Peter Lewis. Peter's the Executive Director of Communications Agency Essential Media, the founder of the collaborative engagement platform Civility, and a fellow with the Australia Institute Centre for Responsible Technology. For more than 2 decades, he's worked with progressive organisations and responsible businesses to effect progressive social change. He's a regular columnist with The Guardian Australian and Fairfax newspapers, as well as the author of 5 books, including Webtopia and the Public Square Project. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, everyone. We might get the whole panel rather than do it formally behind the thing, if that's okay. So, hi, everyone. These are working? Yes. We've got Dirk, we've got Joy, we've got Bob, we've got Genevieve online, I think. Wave, Genevieve. So, we're really lucky. Hello. So I want to make a couple of confessions before we start. The first one is I've never done a symposium before in my life, and I had to Google what a symposium was. And because I'm not an academic, I came up with Mr. Google, who said it's one of 3 things: a meeting or conference for discussing a topic, especially one in which the participants form an audience and make presentations. 2, a collection of writings on a particular topic, as in a magazine. We're probably not there. And 3, a convivial meeting for drinking, music and intellectual discussion around the ancient Greeks. So I reckon what we should do is maybe do a combination of 1 and 3 without the drink. And if anyone wants to give us a bit of music, that would be great as well. My second confession is I'm probably the least qualified person in the room academically. I did graduate with an arts degree, credit average, in 1987. But got onto the student paper at Sydney Uni, fell in love with the sound of my own voice, and away I went into media and politics and advocacy. So I've been outside any sense of academy for a long, long time. And when I got the invitation to be part of this panel, I was delighted because I did not know what I would be walking into. And what I'm really excited about today is to get the mixed perspectives of a panel where we've got an economist, a historian, a cyberneticist, who I still need to understand in my head how to say it, let alone how to describe it, and a systems thinker who started in earth sciences, if I remember properly from our drink last night, Dirk. So I think what I'd love to get out of today is to tap the wisdom of our 4 panellists. What I've proposed is each of them give us a provocation that might be about 8 minutes, and then we've got about 7 minutes to sort of reflect on that. Happy for intake from both the panel and the audience. I should say my superpower is my superficiality. So what I will be trying to do is synthesise things down to the tabloid headline, and then your job will be to say, no, it's more complex than that. And I think that the idea of complexity meets synthesis is a really important contribution that I do think is missing in the way that we think about technology. So in terms of a setup, as we've just heard, we're living through what feels like a critical moment in the interaction between technology and humanity. We've got this rapid introduction of large learning models and so-called generative AI that is just going ahead, leaps at such a speed that I don't even know if we've got time to sit and think about the moment we're in. We're seeing government trying to work things out in real time. At the moment, the federal government has 19 separate inquiries into AI and nobody at the core holding it all together. There are global discussions to set red lines and guardrails, and the tech bros are asking us to put restraints on their own excesses. They're saying, you've got to help us help ourselves. So, and we are all fixated on what comes next. The question is, what can we learn from what's come before to help us understand that moment? So the other thing I'll say is that I think there's a renaissance in what I'd call popular non-fiction writing about these issues at the moment. I've just been immersing myself. If anyone's thinking about books for Santa over the festive season, Power and Progress by Darren Asseglou and Simon Johnson, which is an economic history of technological development. Brian Merchant's Blood in the Machine, the true history of the Luddites. It's a ripping yarn, a bit of history. And Yanis Varoufakis' Techno-Feudalism, the Australian former Greek treasurer who's got an amazing political thesis around what technology is doing to us. So the emerging thesis in all this work is the imperative to recognise the current changes as being both a product and a determinant of the sort of society humans are creating. And at the heart of this is the ongoing interaction, as I said, between technology and humans. But a lot of the debate, from my observation, is on the technology side of that. And so we talk about capacity and we say we need more STEM. We don't say we need more investment in the humanities. And again, I think the broad breadth of the disciplines that are covered by this academy is a latent resource that we need to be tapping to make sense of it. So in a way, I think this panel will be a bit of a showcase of the sort of ideas that we all need to be grappling with. And again, if we can start with allowing somebody as a bowerbird like me to take away some ideas from this, it'll be, for me, a really useful hour. So without further ado, let's start with our first. We're going to do it in the order. Joy Damousi, who's a historian, is going to give us a bit of an overview of the fourth industrial revolution in the context of previous revolutions. Dirk is going to challenge us to think about the way we think about the future. I have no idea what Genevieve is going to talk about, but I'm sure it'll be awesome. And finally, Bob will attempt to blow the whole thing up with a discussion around the idea of creative destruction. So does that sound like a plan? All right, over to you, Joy. You can go to lectern if you like, and then come back down after. And if you go over 10, I might start coughing loudly.
You kind of, raise the red flag. Thank you, Peter. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Auntie Violet, for your lovely welcome. And I too would like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. I have 8 minutes to run you through four revolutions, industrial revolutions. What history tells us is that each industrial revolution since the 18th century has been cataclysmic in magnitude, transformative in impact, shifting and changing every aspect of daily life and society, and enduring. There has not been any opportunity to go back once these industrial revolutions have been set in train. To answer the question of this panel, will it be different this time? That is, during what is now termed the fourth industrial revolution, the short answer I would have to say is no. or at least not without considering or considerable effort being put into addressing some of the abuses and inequalities that have defined and arisen from previous industrial disruptions. While we all have all seen the enormous benefits to wider society of the digital age, benefits are, as we all know, unequally distributed, and abuses have, of course, continued. So what I want to do in this very, very short talk is to look at some of the lessons that we can take from the past in considering and reflecting on a better future. And there are 4 areas I want to focus on in particular today and raise these. If they're my provocation, Peter, these are it. I'm not suggesting there is a seamless continuum, but a pattern that we can discern over the last few centuries. So my 4 areas that I want to raise today are working conditions and workers' rights as a constant throughout all these industrial disruptions, gender inequality, and Sharon raised that, and I know there's going to be more discussion about that later today, but gender inequality has been there from the get-go. Environmental destruction. The environmental destruction of these revolutions has been enduring, and in some cases, have still continue with us today. And the last point I want to make is that in each of these revolutions there's been a vital need for a human-centred critique from the social sciences and the humanities. Now, I know Sharon raised that, we're going to raise that today. But when you look at the history, it is those critiques that have been absolutely fundamental to reflecting on getting a better outcome out of these industrial changes. So let me take you through a sweeping look at these industrial revolutions to brush up on your history. So the first, of course, was the industrialisation of the 18th century and then early 19th centuries, and we know mechanisation shifted agricultural societies to industrialised ones, the invention of new technologies such as mechanised looms for weaving cloth, the steam engine, iron smelting. This produced, of course, enormous economic growth over this period and accelerated economies. But the negative aspects, I think, are also well documented, and we know them, and it is worth reflecting back on these, again, around those 4 pillars that I've identified. Skilled trades rapidly disappeared and workers were displaced, forcing workers to take up jobs where they earned very, very low wages. The appalling living conditions that we recall of the 19th century, where cities became overcrowded because people from the land moved to the cities during the Industrial Revolution, and this created slums and appalling living circumstances, led to gross and escalating poverty and conditions, workplace conditions that were dangerous, hazardous, and of course we know the terrible industrial accidents over this period that occurred. Child labour emerged in the factories. Gender inequality was evident from the beginning, with women being paid less and experiencing gross exploitation. In fact, women were the very first victims of the Industrial Revolution, particularly British women who spun cotton by hand and then spinning wool once machinery superseded the hand spinning of that wool. The environmental destruction over this period was absolutely catastrophic. Powered by coal, the industrial cities churned out massive pollution, creating respiratory diseases, higher death rates in areas that burn more coal, and the burning of fossil fuel churned carbon into the atmosphere. These are all sort of well-documented impacts. What I also want to highlight here are the critics of all of this, and we will recall the poet William Blake, whose beautiful poem, London, charts the destruction of the environment, charts the destruction of the agricultural class. The mine forged manacles, the dark satanic mills, these expressions in his work, to Charles Dickens, to most famously probably Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So the critics of this period were trying to stop industrialisation because they could, from their point of view, see the human cost and environmental cost. Peter talked about the Luddites. Of course, we know that story gave rise to the union movement and workers' rights around the globe. What I want to stress here is from the beginning there were critics, and we need to come back to that this critique of these developments is very important. Moving to the inventions that gave rise to the second industrial revolution from 1870 to 1914, which was almost a century later, we see technological advances include the emergence of new industries around new energy and, of course, electricity, in gas, in oil, and over this period, the internal combustion engine, new forms of communication, the telegraph, the telephone, and the beginning of the 20th century, the birth of the automobile and the plane, as well as mass production, famously in Henry Ford's manufacturing. So mass production, electrification, automation contributed to vast economic growth. But again, coming back to my themes, continuing pollution, extreme environmental damage, and the impact of this continued into the 20th century. The growth of the dramatic growth, continuing growth of unregulated child labour. So by about the turn of the century, over 1 million children were being employed in the US. Inequitable distribution of wages, of course, and women were typically in that group of low-paid work. Critics of mass production and the impact of workers continued over this period in various forms through the union movement, but through new forms of artistic endeavour such as cinema. So we recall Charlie Chaplin in modern times, the archetype of the classic critique of mass production. I should also point out just here that this growth was associated with developments in the West. It is important to stress here that, as historians have argued, that it is not the case that this growth continued in Asia and in Africa, and I think the question of the West has to come up in our discussions throughout the whole day. Who is benefiting and who is not benefiting from the digital society? So it has, the arguments are pretty clear in the literature that before the Industrial Revolution, China and India had the largest manufacturing sectors in the world because they had the largest population, and nations were mostly self-sufficient in that pre-globalisation era. But as the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, Britain's share of goods manufactured increased worldwide, reached a peak of about 1/4 of the late 19th century. Western Europe's share and that of North America also increased. In the same period, the shares of India and China collapsed, and this drop in technological revolution that spread prosperity in the West underdeveloped countries suffered for that. So I think we've got to position whatever we say in that global sense of the West actually being the beneficiaries of many of these developments. The third industrial revolution begins in the mid-20th century and is probably more in our lifetimes into the early 20th with the emergence of computers, electronics, telecommunications, automation, robots, the internet, and all the ones we know. And the move here from mechanical and analogue electronic technology to digital electronics. This third industrial revolution included environmental issues such as air pollution, that continues to be a problem, biodiversity reduction, water pollution, habitat destruction, greenhouse gas emissions, global warming and climate change. Child labour continues around the globe. Workers continue to work in terrible conditions. I won't go on about examples, but the one I will single out is that many of you will recall, November 2022, when Labor activists launched a campaign against Apple and Foxconn for their gross mistreatment of workers at a Chinese factory where half the world's iPhones were made. And many of you will recall in that instance, in that case, there were rising numbers of suicide of workers in the conditions they had to endure in those conditions. Over this period, from the 50s to about the 2000, emerged the field of ethics and technology, and well, I'm sure we'll come back to this, addressing questions such as privacy, the use of data, access to AI, biased data generated by AI, critique of some of the use and abuse of this technology, and the call for policies that need to ensure transparency about what data are generated, for what purpose, and that they are used in a human and ethical way. And this debate obviously continues today. And finally, according to the World Economic Forum, the fourth industrial revolution, the one we are in right now, and I'll quote here, represents a fundamental change in the way we create, exchange and distribute value. It is a technological shift merging our physical, digital and biological worlds into one, and that is a historically distinctive moment in time. The fast developing technologies that we all know, artificial intelligence, genome editing, augmented reality, robotics, etc., are promising smart solutions for intractable challenges in society. There's a revolution that calls for governance of these solutions in the way that empower and foster collaboration, and hopefully build for a more sustainable foundation for social and economic development. What's interesting in this new world is the skill set that's being valued and devalued. It is projected over the coming decade that demand for physical and manual labour will decline by 30%, that demand for basic literacy and numeracy skills will also decline by 20%, and the demand for technological skills, of course, will rise by over 50%. Demand for complex cognitive skills will rise by about 30%, and demand for high-level social and emotional skills will rise by more than 30%. There's some of the statistics. But already, I think we can see some of the similar issues coming and arising from previous disruptions. We continue to have an environmental crisis, including managing energy, water, greenhouse gas emissions, better than previous industrial revolutions when the environment was completely destroyed, but still an issue that I think has to be front and centre of our discussion. Good working conditions, again, opportunities to improve working conditions should be taken, and those that are detrimental to worker autonomy, flexibility and so on should be resisted and avoided. And, you know, worker movements taken on board in terms of occupational health and safety and regulatory frameworks constantly in our minds as well. I know I'm going on about child labour, but that continues, of course, in the supply chains for electronics and for all the technology that we have in our world. Gender inequality, again, continues showing the impact of digital innovation on labour replacement varying, but that women are likely to be in more vulnerable occupation due to gender inequality in the labour market, dominated by STEM, as Sharon indicated, and I know that's an issue we'll be talking about later. But this is an ongoing constant, that question about gender inequality. So finally, as in other historical periods, it is the ongoing critiques from the social sciences and the humanities that will be required for a better society to emerge. I don't think it's going to just happen, and I don't think it's just going to happen naturally. I think if our aim is for a better society, we have to have these critiques front in mind. Throughout history, it has been social activists, agitators, academics, researchers, scholars and others, creative thinkers who have raised and continue to raise the ethical, social, cultural and political impacts of the digital society, how we navigate it and how we ensure it will be better this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. I do recognise that you crammed an hour lecture of really rich detail into a little bit over 8 minutes, but that was terrific. And a really interesting framework for thinking through the moment we're in, almost a checklist. One of the questions I had for you was, the reading I've done has sort of made the distinction between technology driven from the top down, particularly technology over the 4 waves, which is purely driven by capitalism, and the role of countervailing power in mitigating it. And what do you think we can learn from previous waves around that notion of building countervailing power so that we're in a position that it's not just going to roll over the top of us this time?
Well, I think Peter...
Yeah, it kind of catches up with you, yeah.
It's on?
Yeah.
I think, it's always, historically it's been the case that technological advances have been imposed, right? And we all have to respond. And I guess one of the ways to mitigate the inequalities or the dangers of that is to have regulatory frameworks and governance that checks. I think it's a check and balance thing, right? That, you know, capitalism can't just go wild, or that the technology can't ride roughshod. And I think things like, I mean, frankly, environmental checks would be a good start. I know there are environmental checks now, but those sort of issues, I think, occupational safety, I mean, health and safety, I mean, they're basic things, but we know around the world these conditions are not being addressed entirely, consistently.
You talk about the Luddites giving rise to the union movement. This latest wave is coming at a historically weak moment for the union movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess when you look at the organised union movement, I mean, I'm not an expert on the organised union movement as it is today, but certainly there needs to be probably a better critique of the impact of workers and what can be done to ensure better conditions and better regulations, whether it comes from the union movement, whether it comes from government, you know, but that broad principle is my point, Peter.
Bob?
Yes, thinking about the union movement, I mean, there are two initiatives which are trying to check unregulated labour markets. One is to do with the gig economy, and there are some newly formed unions or movements which are trying to make an impact there. And of course, the other one, much more publicised, which includes AI, is the screenwriters and then the actors in Hollywood. And they really have, I mean, I think they're in a very strong labour market position because COVID has reduced the content that these studios can produce. So they're doing this at the right time, and they are trying to specify whether they're going to use AI, whether studios are giving them AI-generated material, and that they have the right not to use AI. So, you know, they have celebrities to back them up, but I think it's a good start.
And exactly, Bob. And in fact, I have that down on my list of things to mention. No, it's great you've raised it because I was just conscious of time. I mean, who would have thought Hollywood would come to a grinding halt?
Yeah.
I mean, I found that example quite extraordinary. Who would have thought that Hollywood would just be at a standstill? So there is still power that workers have to bring it. But for how long, I guess, is the issue.
Yeah, I
is
think the Hollywood thing is fascinating, and it ties into human creation. So you've got the screenwriters, it's happening with musicians, it's happening with authors, it's happening with journalists. My book, Webtopia, which is critiquing tech, I found out is part of the 180,000 books that have been taken by Book 3 and then fed into machine learning so it can critique itself. They didn't even take the academic journals, like they took the superficial ones. That says a lot about machine learning. Dirk, I don't know if you want one final... I'm very conscious that we need to give this time to everyone, but maybe, Dirk, if you want to sort of reflect but also lead into your piece as well. And feel free to go to the lectern or do it on the chair.
I think I'd rather just begin.
Yeah, why don't you? Because I'm sure it'll cut either across or straight through what we've been talking about.
I will address it specifically. But before I begin, first I'd like to thank you all for the invitation to come and present some ideas which I think are really fascinating, well worth considering, but also really difficult to get our heads around. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. This is a meeting of the Academy of Social Sciences on the digital society for a better future. And I'd like to just begin by looking at those words so they do not escape our attention. In this group here in this room, if I polled everyone and said, what is society, we probably would come to a convergence of ideas. If I polled the room and said, what is science, we probably would come to a convergence of ideas. But my suspicion is if I polled the room and asked, what is digital, we would be all over the map. And yet we use this concept of the digital society as if it's just a given. It's not problematic. It is something that we all know. But heck, you know, I'm not digital. Peter's not digital. This lectern is not digital. And yet somehow we're all haunted by this idea that somehow Google has a digital, or Facebook has a digital version of us, or in Peter's case, the ATO has a digital version of him, or someplace that there is a computer, a machinery, a lathe that cranks these out in some manufacturing plant that's a digital version. And the question is not whether or not things are digital, it's where this concept of digital becomes salient for what we do. When we have laws that are enacted digitally, your self-driving car will not exceed the speed limit or park in this reserved spot. This is an exertion of power. This is politics. but it's technology. So how do we distinguish between the two? When we have meetings online that are digitally mediated, all kinds of things happen in neuroscience, all kinds of things happen in terms of our communication that we're completely unaware of, and we just say, that's the way it is. And these kinds of questions, I think, really are necessary to ask if we're going to talk about the future of these digital things in a society. One of the questions I have for you, how many of you in your research, anybody, just by a raise of hands, explicitly discuss the future in your research? So just one example, who can tell us, in what way do you view the future? What is your relationship to that future? Anyone? Is it a prediction? Is it a forecast? Is it an extrapolation? Is it an extension? Is it an imagination? In what way does your research relate to the future? Anyone?
It's an attempt to try to shape it.
So an attempt to try to shape the future through design or strategy or construction of policy. Anyone else? So this creative aspect, which I will get to in a minute. Anybody else? What's your relation? A number of you raised your hands. Don't be shy. You're academics. Don't be shy. Possibility. A possibility. So a possibility, a plausibility statement, something that could happen. And this is something that I find really quite fascinating, and that when I look at the philosophy of science and our scientific apparatus is set up so that we see a phenomenon, and then we collect data, observations or experiments or literature or history, and we are immediately talking about the past. Because all data is in the past. All data is in the past. The empirics of our general social sciences is always in the past, which we then assume has a trajectory into the present, into the phenomena we are looking at, and then we extend this into the future. This is the apparatus most of us use. Another very common apparatus is that we can create it, that the future is not Australia terra nullius, empty land, it's temporal nullius, empty time. We can create anything we want, anything digital, we can make a utopia, we can make a dystopia, but we can create it. Both of these are very flawed ways of addressing, I think, the most pressing issue is how do we study phenomena that have not yet happened? We do not have an apparatus for doing that. Or I should say, we have multiple apparatus for doing that. We have forecasting. We have technological forecast, technological foresight. We have predictive models. We have backcasting. We have wargaming. We have Delphi studies. We have 40 some odd methods in future studies. But they're rarely used in academia. They're used in industry and by government quite a bit. But they're rarely used in academia, and I've always wondered why. Why aren't we in an area that's talking about the digital society, not now, the digital society 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? If that's what we're doing, creating a digital society, how can we address what we are creating in a way that allows us to make informed decisions right now? What are the apparatus we have available to us to do this? So the creative aspect is something we've heard of. It's the Elon Musks of the world, it's the Zuckerbergs of the world, it's the Altmans of the world, and yet they should all go talk to Tim Berners-Lee, one of the founders of the internet, who has recently said the internet, which was planned for this wonderful geographic collaborative platform, this fantastic leveling of the economic playing field, this wonderful place to overcome diversity, has become, not entirely, but in large part, one of the major drivers of diversity, one of the major drivers of economic inequalities. And looking at how they had a probability statement about what the internet was going to become, and then what it did become, is, I think, a lesson we want to take to heart as we think about social sciences. So, as a kid, which meant last year, I was really fascinated and absolutely loved reading science fiction. And an image that sticks with me was the cover of Isaac Asimov's book, I, Robot. 1950. This 3-meter high robot carrying what you assume is a human in a spacesuit. And what Asimov did was he talked about, in a fictional form, the way in which these autonomous machineries were simply part and parcel, totally unnoticed. You've got contracts, they had service calls, they broke down occasionally, they ran amok. You had to come up with some laws to deal with them, but they were unnoticed as part of society. They weren't bright, shiny objects. That's, I think, what we need to begin to be able to do. What happens when we're no longer looking at technology as anything remarkable, anything different? It's just like flipping the switch and the electricity, the lights come on. We don't notice that anymore. That's what digital is going to become. That is the society we have not yet gotten to. So my challenge, my provocation here is, how do we overcome this epistemic distance between the now and what we are going to be in the future? What kinds of tools, techniques, thinking would inform us of forays into these futures that we can actually enter into some alternative worlds and then look back at where we are and say, what are the decisions we're making now and how are these interacting? How do we do this, not just about the artifact, the technology, but about the way in which we live together, the social aspect of what a society is? So I think if the Association of Social Science continues, or as it continues, its mission to support evidence-driven decision-making, one of the critical aspects we have facing us is, how do we develop techniques and credible ways of thinking that allow us to grasp phenomena, technology, society, and the environment that have not yet happened? Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, you delivered on the provocation, Dirk. When I was talking to you last night, the thought that was in my mind was the extra complexity is, how do you do this thinking in a system that's already in the system we have, particularly around digital, where the models of surveillance capitalism are actually shaping the way people behave. And so do you have those, how would you approach having these conversations either inside the system we have, or do you need to find alternate systems to have those conversations about the future?
It's a great question, and I don't think it's, for me, it's not either or.
Yeah.
It's we have to do it within the system because we have no choice. For those of us that are academics, we are in a system that demands publication, that has certain requirements, and it's very hard to get alternative thinking past reviewers. But I also notice historically that this is not new, that many of the most innovative thinkers ran into difficulty and they were unable to publish their work because nobody accepted it because it was different. So changing the institutional system to allow for forward-leaning thinking, for more speculative work, which is a major part of science anyway. It's long, speculation and imagination are foundational to science across history, but getting our institutions to accept that as legitimate work, but then also working with policymakers in sandboxes, in places like the Institute for the Future, or studies that are in the UK working with policymakers about exactly speculating futures as a way of critiquing present decision making. So I think it's both inside academia and outside, but it's going to be an ongoing challenge.
Do either of you guys want to make a comment?
Thank you, Dirk.
Bring
That was
Genevieve in
terrific.
as well. Feel free to pipe up. You're on the big screen as well, Genevieve. So
We can see you, Genevieve. You can't hide. I think it will give rise to new disciplines, right? Just like economics came out of certain conditions, circumstances, interactions, crises. There are disciplines we have not yet discovered that will come in the next even 10 years, 5 years, let alone 50 years. So, and they will be an amalgam of what we have, right? They'll be what we call interdisciplinary now, but they will stand on their own. And we might not even be alive to know what they are. But I think that's probably, if you look historically, disciplines will merge, disciplines will fade away, disciplines will intersect to create something new. And I think when you're looking at imagining the future, that process will generate new ways of thinking that we don't know yet.
I agree on the notion of the disciplinary change and that we're going to see ways of looking at data, but not just extrapolating trajectories, but thinking differently because of our data. I want to emphasize that what I see as a distinction, this is not futurism. This is not what is the future going to be. It is creating alternative worlds that give us the opportunity to think about what we are doing now. Not that that future will ever happen, but one of the difficulties historically is we're saying everything's different, digital society, and yet we're still using the same concepts, the same instruments, the same measurements that we used in the Industrial Revolution, and yet everything's different. Well, those two statements cannot both be true. If everything's different, we need new apparatus for understanding the phenomena. Otherwise, the phenomena become normalized and they disappear because we're unable to even see them. And so the new disciplines would be a great way to go about that.
Can I just quickly add, sorry, Peter, I've just, with a number of colleagues, finished an article about those during the First World War imagining life after the war, right? So how did people imagine life after the Great War when they were in the middle of it? And that gave rise to surrealism, right? And a whole range of new creative movements and disciplines, actually, after the war. But the imagining process is fascinating to document, actually, and watch, because people are trying to grapple with making sense of this carnage and violence and how they're going to get out of it when they're in the thick of it. It's a great, great question. Thank you.
Likewise, the human rights frameworks that emerged from World War II, right? Yeah. Bob, and then we'll give the floor to Genevieve.
Yes, I think the idea of imagined futures has had quite a good literature on this kind of area. It's a way of jumping beyond data analysis through induction. And some people talk about abductive reasoning, where it's kind of creative guesswork, if you like, providing it's grounded in something, I think is important. Homes Fit for Heroes is a classic case of an imagined future for post-war, and that has resonance even before it's happened, doesn't it?
All right, we better keep moving to make sure we get the most out of the hour. So you are going to provoke us, Genevieve. I've got no idea what your provocation is, but I'm very excited to be provoked. So over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And I realise I have been your most recalcitrant speaker on this panel. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation today. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present of this place and acknowledge that I am, as I always am in Australia, on land that was always sacred and never ceded. And I take Auntie Violet's injunction here that it's not just about acknowledgement, it's about commitment about what we do next. And so what I want to do next, Peter, with your, I guess, guidance and hope is give you a provocation. And I want to sort of start it by reminding people that I'm not only a cybernetician, but I'm also an anthropologist. And so I want to tell you a story about something anthropologists did a long, long time ago. And Joy, happily for you, starting right in the middle of World War II, leading out of it. But I want to start with a quote. And imagine this is a conversation that is happening across a dining room table in 1976 in Palo Alto, California. And the voice is a woman's voice, and she says this: there were mathematicians and physicists, people trained in the physical sciences who were very, very precise in what they wanted to think about. There were a small group of us, anthropologists and psychiatrists, who were trained enough about psychology in groups so that we knew what was happening and could use it and disallow it. And then there were one or two or three gossips in the middle, who were very simple people who had a lot of loose intuition and no discipline to what they were doing. In a sense, it was the most interesting conference I'd ever been in because no one knew how to manage this thing yet. That's Margaret Mead, American anthropologist, reflecting on an event that she attended repeatedly in the 1940s and early 1950s. And that event was a conference that happened in New York City, starting in 1944 and finishing in 1954. That conference was convened under the banner of the Macy's Foundation, which was a philanthropic fund in New York City dedicated to creating conversations across the disciplines about the future. And the conversation they funded and made possible in the 1940s and 1950s was a conference called the Macy's Conference of Cybernetics. Now, of course, when the conference started, the word cybernetics didn't exist yet. What existed instead was a mouthful of words that went something like the social and biological teleological mechanisms for circular causality and feedback. Nice. Unsurprisingly, that was a conference name that didn't take. And it wasn't until a man named Norbert Wiener realized that the introduction of computing, as Joy lays out for that sort of third revolution, that the introduction of computing would fundamentally reframe the relationship between humans and machines. And he was really interested in understanding, was there a way of abstracting that relationship out so that you could predict it and make sense of it? And of course, because he was a mathematician, the language of abstraction he went to was mathematics. And he attempted to work out, could you create a series of formulas that would explain and predict the relationship between humans and computers? And if you could predict and explain that relationship, what would it look like? And what would be the nature of that relationship? And he went looking for a word to describe it, and the word he landed on was a word he made up, and that word was cybernetics. So that word is a word pulled through from the Greek. It means to steer in ancient Greek. It is the sense of steering a small boat through the water. So it's not completely about control, but about a vague directionality. That conversation around cybernetics ended up inviting many different practitioners into it, people from anthropology and psychology, psychiatry, neurobiology, mathematics, logic, philosophy, electrical engineering. It had some of the chief proponents of computing of the day, the inventor of the first computer. It had people who were going to create DARPA and the internet, and it had a collection of these social scientists there. And when I think about the thing we can pull through from that moment, wasn't just that people were willing to actively engage in imagining the future and simultaneously disrupting the present to make that future possible. And their orientation to the future was one of building it collectively and collaboratively, and of imagining that in building that future, they wanted to make sure that they were clear about their intentionality and their politic. The cybernetics conversation has lots of consequences. It gives rise to artificial intelligence, so they probably don't get a passing grade for that. It also gives rise to computer-driven art. It is part of the inspiration for Eno's creation of Bowie's albums in Berlin in the 1970s. So I reckon anything that starts in New York and ends up with David Bowie in Berlin might be a good thing. It's also something that profoundly changes how anthropology is unfolded in the United States. It's where we move from a Boasian taxonomy to the notion of culture as a web and a system. 6 things that I think come out of that feel hugely important to the 21st century. One was a focus on the idea of a system, that you couldn't talk about a future as a state. You needed to talk about it as a relationship between component pieces. And it wasn't just the component pieces, it was the dynamism of that relationship that was important. So the future is always a system. Second piece they're deeply invested in is this notion that you have to have the widest range of voices possible in the conversation. So they are deeply invested in the productive discomfort that comes from a range of voices clashing with one another and the pieces you build in that conversation. So they were invested in something long before we called it interdisciplinarity. The third piece they're invested in building the future is the notion that the conversation has to be iterative. You don't get it done in one go. You have to continuously reinvest in unfolding the transformation that will be the future. The third piece, I think, or the fourth piece, I think here that they're really concerned to contemplate is that the future can't be amorphous or a level playing field in some ways. They imagine the future has to have a politic to it, that there have to be a sense of what will happen in that future that is attentive to dynamics around power and agency and ideas about responsibility. And in that sense, the future is not a neutral playing ground. It's one we need to have carefully thought about who is enacting what and why. And last but by no means least, in this really interesting way for that collection of people, they were all
just at the moment, the most interesting. What a great, I'm confident we will get Genevieve back in a sec. But poor old thing. One of the things I was thinking when she was talking there, and maybe just get, so if all that is true and there's been this cybernetics alliance, is it that Mark Zuckerberg and the big tech bros didn't get the memo, or is there something that's failed in the way that movement has influenced the rollout of technological change? One of you answer, or I can just, that can be purely Socratic, I don't know. But it feels to me that what Genevieve's just described is, of course, the alliance you need guiding the technology. But we're in a world where we've got these platforms that are, as Cory Doctorow calls it, inshitifying. They're almost unusable. I see that we're trying to tweet, which is basically, you know, putting things down the toilet. And at the same time, these are the guys that are running the next, the generative learning and the AI. It's going to be the big tech companies that are rolling that out as well. So if humanities and social sciences are part of this grand alliance to mediate it, where's the way in?
Well, one of the things that I emphasize in that question is a lot of people, and certainly we all have multiple students, and many people do not see that they have a choice, and they cannot envision an alternative. The very idea of living without Facebook or living without Google or living without Amazon or whatever their platform of choice, without X, formerly known as Twitter, is simply beyond their comprehension that this is even possible. And nobody's offered them an alternative. So there is a dominance effect, there is a monopoly effect that has been created that then reinforces itself. It's a feedback, you know, that there are no alternatives. So for me, one of the really important aspects is creating these envisioning alternatives for discussion of saying what are the negatives, what are the downsides that we're seeing, and these alternatives would have less of that, or they would have more benefits, that you would escape, you would have agency back, you would not simply be subjected to the algorithm. But I think one of the major problems is, as a society, those alternatives are not visible, partly because they're not there, but they're also not discussed unless you're a reader of science fiction or history.
Yeah, I left Twitter at the end of last year when Genevieve, you cut out just when after the words "most interestingly." So I don't know if you can rewind back to your fourth point, most interestingly. Over to you, Genevieve. You can't hear us, can you? Awkward Zoom. Can you? Yeah. So you were mid-sentence. And the words that you cut out on and froze on were most interestingly.
Clearly come to us with stable
so you've set a high bar
technology
here. Most interestingly.
I can, but you can't hear me.
Yes, we can.
Oh, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And the sentence was most interesting.
Yeah. So what was it?
Excellent. Most interesting. Oh, that's entertaining. Most interestingly, it's about the notion of how it is that you hold the technology with an idea that it needs to hold its form, but changes just a little bit.
Great. So the question I then posed to the panel, and maybe for you too, can you hear us? Not if you can hear. No, she cannot hear. So we will not. Is anyone on the Zoom and they can type to her that? So there is a delay. So it's like we're zooming in from a war zone and there's a bit of a time delay. So, you know, when they nod at the hosts. So the question that we asked while you were down, Genevieve, was given where we are at the moment and the dominance of big tech, does that speak to a failure of the cybernetics movement, or was it just that the tech bros didn't get the memo? I'm hoping she heard that. No, this is getting awkward. I reckon we're going to hope that you get your connection working for the last 5 minutes of Q&A.
I think it's probably a combination of both, Peter. When AI rolls out of cybernetics in the 1950s, the conversation And it is.
That's a pity, but it still worked in delay form, but I reckon it's a little bit awkward. So we might see if we can get Genevieve back in for the end and maybe even take some questions from the floor. I want to hand over now to Bob. So I had a brief email exchange with Bob, and I got the impression he just wanted to blow the whole discussion up. And then when I met him this morning, he said, yes, I'm going to talk about creative destruction. So over to you, Bob.
Yeah, okay. I'm a skeptic, and I'm skeptic of all this talk about revolutions. I'm skeptical towards the utopia of general artificial intelligence being just around the corner. And I'm skeptical equally of the cataclysmic prophets of doom. Everyone wants to be a prophet in this area. And it's a good question, how can we say anything meaningful about the future? Now, the worst thing you can say about AI, or one of the worst things you could say, is that it operates as a stochastic parrot. That is, where stochastic in this context probably means random, and parrots are taught to mimic. Perhaps it's even worse than that, because AI is subject to hallucination, and no one quite knows why it produces strange, inexplicable outputs, like citing legal cases to help lawyers, cases which never happened, or judgments which never happened. And Jan LeCun, the chief scientific officer of Meta, said, okay, it can predict, but it can't understand. So it has no sense of itself as an actor, no sense of itself, certainly as a moral actor, no sense of itself as, or no sense of what it is that humans are doing in things like tacit knowledge. Now, I accept AI has an open frontier and all sorts of changes are likely to happen. I also accept that generative AI represents a significant development with these large language models and the multimodal foundational models that can generate text, video, audio, and so forth. But I'd like to, instead of using the word revolution and seeing AI as the fourth or fifth revolution, I'd like to make a skeptical point about gradualism. The Industrial Revolution, the idea of the Industrial Revolution occurred well after most of the key innovations that people talk about, textile, steam engine, and so forth. The rural population of England increased up until the middle of the 19th century, although it declined in relative terms. It took a long time to get the steam engine to work properly. We grew up with Walt Rostow's conception of a takeoff into self-sustained growth being concentrated in perhaps 2 decades. And subsequent Marxist theory a bit later on wanted equally to think about revolution. Economic historians, I'm not an economist, I was an economic historian once, they've measured things like capital formation and productivity in the so-called Industrial Revolution, and it's very limited, it's very slow, it's very gradual. So things take time, there are gaps. And so I think we have to accept, and there is some work similarly on other industrial revolutions, so I think we have to accept that that is certainly an important aspect of the past, and how does it compare with the present? Well, the founding conference of AI, I think, was in 1956. And since then, AI suffered a number of winters as well as summers. And this is partly answer to your question. I think originally AI tended to operate within the realms of symbolic logic, which didn't really work. So the new entrepreneurs were really taking a new route. So my title was going to be Too Early to Tell, because I'm skeptical also of the proposition. I think it is too early to tell about the transformative aspect of and the revolutionary aspect. And I have to say, no one's actually making money out of generative AI at the moment, although huge billions are going into it. People are making money out of cloud services and the new techniques which will enable AI. So interesting. Are there going to be a lot of business failures? People built too many railways in the 19th century. Many people went bust. Are there going to be people going bust? I don't know. Interesting. So I'm skeptical about a lot of things there, and I'm skeptical. I think there are harms linked with the development of AI, and I think I'm not persuaded about the mass unemployment outcome, because typically these periods of technological change create new jobs as well as destroying others. There's an important International Labour Office study which, instead of looking at the impact of AI on in destroying jobs, it was looking on how far they add or destroy tasks. And if your job has multiple tasks involved in it, you're less vulnerable than if you have a single task, like a routine clerical worker, or you're in a very poorly regulated area like online freelancing work. So there are a whole lot of questions there. I think I'm more worried about the use of AI to generate misinformation and to exploit private data and personal data, which people have never given their consent to be used. The manipulative monetization of what goes on social media, I think, is extremely worrying. So, is it creative destruction? Schumpeter is often credited with that. It's actually a far older idea that creative things can come out of destruction. In fact, Nietzsche was very important in German intellectual life leading up to Schumpeter. And of course, there's a lot one could say about Nietzsche, but he did have this concept of Übermensch, and I wondered if perhaps Elon Musk saw himself as an Übermensch. And I'm afraid I will tell the Life of Brian joke at this point. Elon Musk is not the new Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. He's actually worse than a naughty boy, but that's the only joke. So I don't think the idea of creative destruction, although the Silicon Valley thing about act swiftly, break something, although is there, I don't think this obsession with breaking things is particularly helpful, and it feeds into a kind of rather malign sense of techno-optimism, in my view. We can think of perhaps creative disruption. I don't think it needs Übermensch to do that, because there's a lot of work done by teams of people. There's this obsession with individuals who make innovations, and sometimes that's exactly how it works. But the development of transformers, which link in with the new architecture of large language models and multimodal foundation models, that was developed by a team of 8 people within Google. And there's a famous article, which when I read it some time ago, this is from 2017. I think it'd been already cited 82,000 times. And that was by a team of 8 people working on different disciplines within Google. And they produced this, and they came from many countries in the world, not just US, Canada, but Ukraine, Poland, France, India. And there are women there as much as men. So in young scientists, the gender issue is somewhat more different than it might have been in the past, I think. So that's an interesting development, and I'm wondering about what we should take into account work teams, team organisation, and the relationship of artificial intelligence to that. So I'm working with creative disruption, but I'll perhaps finish with Harvard Business School recently did a study of Boston consulting. This is consulting work, and that recognised the existence of work teams, and it also recognised the way in which AI could be used not to destroy a segment of that team because of the tasks they did, but it recognised people who could choose or were able to use their special skills in various combinations. So they had cyborgs was one category of people who really were highly digitalised, who might even try and improve the digital inputs they were getting. I'm constantly on that. And another group was centaurs, which were a combination of people who could use AI but really preferred not to. I mean, using more qualitative skills in the development of consulting advice. So this is a point about collectivities as part of this, rather than regarding the workforce as a kind of atomised target for malign AI, but looking at these sorts of complexities. And just one last point. There was a rapid response interim report by the chief scientist to the minister on artificial intelligence, which a number of people here, I think, contributed to, including Genevieve. And that is an extremely good read. If you'd like to see how it's possible to look at all this, recognising what we don't know, what is currently indeterminate, and so forth, I really recommend you read that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Bob. Again, and I go back to it as my book of the year, Power and Progress. Asoglu and Johnson make the point that if you look at the waves of technological change, the idea that technology just leads to productivity doesn't stand up. If the technology leads to surveillance or automation, it leads to a concentration of wealth, and it's only when the technology is what he describes as machine usefulness, it's a tool, it's a connection, it's knowledge or a market, that you actually get the productivity dividends. And his clincher is that that's got to be designed by workers, and the idea of works councils around technology, I think, is a really interesting and inspiring sort of idea to sort of hold on to at the end of that analysis as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. The United States Trade Union Federation, AFL-CIO, have done quite a lot of work on AI. And for example, they've looked at the problems of implementing electrification in the 1930s in the Tennessee Valley Authority. And they use the slogan, workers know stuff, to, I mean, they may not know everything, but nobody knows everything. Workers should be part of the design process. And I recommend reading some of their work. Yeah.
Great. We've got 5 minutes for questions. If anyone wants to make a contribution from the floor, now is the time. Otherwise, we'll just chat on the panel for the last 5 minutes.
Peter, if I could...
Let's go, Dirk, while we're...
I just would like to comment on Bob's comments and much of the conversation in general. One of the things that I find really quite surprising, I exist in a business school, and so I'm surrounded by people who are interested in business and organizations all the time. And yet, as a group of social scientists, the way in which we inexorably reduce society to, at the risk of insulting the economists of the room, but we inexorably reduce the conversations around AI and technology to what it will do to or for workers, what it will do to or for economies. The alternative worlds idea that I'm pushing is, where is this idea of collectivism as society, that we are not individuals, we are collectives. We are collectives with more than human species that are at significant risk of disappearing. Where are the ideas of the arts? Where are the ideas of spirituality? Where are the ideas of what makes human in these discussions? Rather, and deploying and thinking and designing and creating worlds that are not merely changing who gets to win. And that, I think, is a really important conversation, particularly from social science, because we're not going to see it from industry. The ideology of industry is not one of human flourishing. But this is where social scientists, I think, have a very different set of ideas of what value means, and not being trapped in economics and productivity.
It's a really interesting extension of those three wonderful questions that Zuboff puts in the terms of surveillance capitalism, which is who knows, who knows, who knows, and who decides. And I think those are the questions that you're obviously grappling with a lot.
Extending that, I think questions in the back.
Well, thanks very much for a really interesting opening session. I'm Greg Bamber at Monash University, and of course history is the best guide to the future that we have, talking about possible predictions, but although, as Oscar Wilde said, predictions are especially difficult about the future. And Joy mentioned the importance of regulation. I wonder if we might just dwell on that, not only now but during the day a little bit, because we saw earlier industrial revolutions did prompt some very astute regulators, antitrust sort of regulators in the US, for example, breaking up big oil. One of the differences with that industrial revolution and the current one is that the tech bros are very adept at innovating very quickly, breaking things if necessary. They're also very adept at lobbying governments. This government here in Canberra, the government in the US and so on, and they're saying to governments, well, we can engage in voluntary regulation, but that's an oxymoron. That's a complete contradiction. Voluntary regulation doesn't work. The only regulatory authority that seems to be trying to make an attempt at regulating the tech bros, if you like, is the EU. And so any reflections on regulation, because the regulators are still fighting the last war, to use the military metaphor again that Joy used, whereas the tech bros are racing ahead to the next war. And they've got immense power. You know, these giant oligopolies based in the US and some based in China. None of them are really based here or in the UK, which is playing at having a summit and a conversation between Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk. What a sort of nonsense that was. If you haven't seen it, you can pick it up on YouTube if you wish. So thank you again for a wonderful...
Okay, so I don't know if anyone wants to respond. Just really quickly, you may be aware that Biden's appointed Lena Khan as the FTC chair, and she's actually having a real crack at the big platforms. There's a big case against both Amazon and Google, and that's about enforcement of existing laws. And I agree with you, regulation is really hard. In Canberra, the big tech, big media, we've been trying to get privacy law through for 40 years, and there is always the pushback. Civil society, there's about 5 of us. We're like a Potemkin village trying to, and you know, against lobbyists that are in ministers' offices each and every day. So there is a massive power imbalance, which goes back to that need of engaging the academy with civil society to the extent that we have any, to actually be that sense of countervailing power. Because otherwise, you're right, they're going to regulate their privilege. But I don't know if anyone else has any statements on that.
Thank you for raising that, and thank you for framing it so eloquently. All I'll say is, historically, you're absolutely right, this has been a constant, right? And the need for regulation is ever more urgent now, as Peter and yourself are saying. So just to stress that.
I think it's an excellent point, but I want to again critique the point of the only things that we know how to regulate are the things that have happened in the past. How do we even think about the new risks of the digital, whatever that's going to be? How do you regulate something that hasn't happened that you can't even envision? Because the things that are going to be at risk in the future are not what we are currently thinking about. And that's a question that I have no answer to. But I think it's imperative to not simply say we need regulations, because they are going to miss the critical risks that emerge as these systems intertwine.
The final point, though, I think, is that we don't kid ourselves that because it's new, it's free of the law of the land. Uber comes in and says we're not a taxi service, we're a ride sharing where you pay us to take you from A to B, therefore we don't need regulation. I think, we have labour law, we have copyright law, we have competition law, and part of it is not to concede that this is so new that it is a lawless Wild West. It's not. It's based on the work of previous movements, previous revolutions, and maybe just to tie the whole thing up, I know it's time for morning tea. I've really appreciated everyone's input. I just want to do a quick ad. If anyone is interested in these things, I'm launching a new initiative in Melbourne on the 5th of December called the Centre of the Public Square with Per Capita, which is going to be all about how we give citizens a voice in the way this moves forward. And I also do a regular podcast called Burning Platforms. So I think I've got 3 guests that I'll be having very soon. So it's been great to meet all of you. Thank you for the audience engagement, and we'll see you all at morning tea. Cheers.